think I've done alright in this Indie Accords readathon. Hi, and welcome back to the channel. My name's Chris, and I am going to do my monthly reading wrap-up for the month of, let's get this right, July. July was the month of the Indie Accords readathon, something that I took part in. I didn't read as much as I thought I would read. A couple of trips away, a couple of people visiting. Just seemed I never really got a head of steam up at any stage. But I still did manage to read 5 books for that, and 7 books in total for the month. So we've got 7 books to go through, one of which I've done a full review of, which I'll indicate as I go through. But I'll just say a word to start off with about the Indie Accords. Now, let's be honest, it's not about who wins. You know, taking part and reading great books was all that it was ever about. And whether you won or lost was neither here nor there. Now, the results aren't out yet. We're not going to win. Dark Knights tried really hard. Maybe it was my fault. I think it was my fault. I didn't read what I was supposed to read. Kind of felt the pressure a little bit of it. Maybe it was performance anxiety. Whatever. If you did win, I mean, congratulations, but it was never the point, was it? Like, come on. Yeah. The enthusiasm of everybody involved, but whether you're an author or not an author, kind of contributed to this amazing event, and one that I very much look forward to in the future. Thank you everybody who was involved, both in terms of organising, participating in the conversation, some of the smack talk, both in the channel and off the channel. Like, great fun. Let's talk about some books. First book I'm going to talk about, though, is from a well-established indie author. It is Cahill. Book 1 of the Bound and Broken series, which is A Blood and Fire. Now, this is quite a well-established and liked book. Some people say the second book gets even better, which is astonishing because I think the first book's brilliant. There's some dispute about the reading order of this because there's a prequel novel for it. Lots of people say they don't care. Some people care a lot about the reading order. But I started here, and I will say I can tell you without ever reading it what the prequel is going to be about. It was nice going in knowing nothing. In fact, all that I really knew about of Blood and Fire was that it was an Aragon type telling of story. And that's great because I never read Aragon at all. In fact, I've never... Well, I have seen the film, but I really wasn't paying attention. I don't really have an awful lot to base it off. So for all intents and purposes, I knew nothing about it, which was good because I wasn't prepared for actually how much of a high fantasy tale this was and how it fit the tropes of all of those things that come with that. I was expecting something that was a bit more focused around dragons, and certainly dragons play a part, etc. But it was very much about the young boys from the small village, the kind of fellowship that they have, the journey that they go on, the strangers that they meet, that change and influence their fortunes, and the factions, etc. that you get involved with. It was a terrific read. It's about 470 odd pages, although reasonably enough paced and spread out, chunky enough read. But this is a beautiful hardback copy of this with a lovely soft touch kind of feel of the wrap, and a rather beautiful naked hardback that sits in behind from Broken Binding. So, of Blood and Fire, really enjoyed the start of the series. We'll look forward to probably doing the prequel, then a second novel in due course, because it was a quick read. All of the love and praise that's been heaped upon this series so far, even after our book, I can certainly back up and agree with and say big thumbs up for that one. That was a great book to have in the middle of my reading month. Second book that I'm going to talk about is one that was recommended again by a number of channels. Cahill from Kay's Hidden Shelf had done a review of it. Andrew from Andrew's Wizardly Reads had done a review about it. And they had suggested this book was like a young adult middle grade book, but it had enough in it that adults could get something out of it. And it was A.R. Witham's The Legend of Black Jack. Now, I'd seen some interviews with Andy, but kind of suggested that there might be a bit of lightness and gaiety to it because that's who Andy seems to be as a person. And so that proved to be. Legend of Blackjack is a book that I feel was written kind of with me in mind. It was a book that seeks to connect with the young male and the older male in terms of adventure stories. I talked a few weeks ago now, I suppose, in the 2 Books tag about some of my earliest books, my earliest memories of books when I was at school, or the types of books that I was reading when I was a younger man. So reading Treasure Island, Kidnapped with Robert Louis Stevenson, reading Harry Pay, The Pirate, The Sword and the Stone. Books of high adventure and books of a young boy who wants to affect the world and wants a fantastical life or be involved in stories that are more interesting than his humdrum of his day. What I wasn't expecting necessarily was that the book would have a bit of a dark edge and a dark theme to it. The book tells the story of Jack Smith, who's a young boy who doesn't have a great time in his day-to-day life. He's incredibly bright, he's incredibly smart, and he's setting himself up for great things in the future, but he gets abducted away in a portal fantasy to help fix another problem. Except they've abducted him a bit too early in his life, because the skills that he's been asked for he doesn't seem to have yet, and he ends up in a world that is fantastical. There's a lot of talking animals, or a lot of animals that are anthropomorphized. That seems very ordinary. It seems to be the run of the mill for this world. And you have Jack that goes on this sort of chosen one voyage where he's maybe not the center of the story, maybe he is the center of the story, but he goes along and has to escape from pirates, things hunting him. There's creatures, there's baddies, goodies, there's a bit of becoming a nothingness. It's an all action tale. Kind of jumps from scene to scene where something seems to be happening. There's a legend to be told, the legend of Black Jack, and there's a story that's going to end up be told. Sort of feels like part of a series, but it's very much a standalone. There's a full arc to be told in here, and it's closed off, and I dearly hope that we'll get another book in this series. It's very much action heavy. There are only a few characters, I would say, that kind of have a full narrative arc, so that who they are at the start changes as they go through the story, but that's not the intention of the story. The intention of the story is to tell a story of a young man who's searching for identity, searching for a connection with people, and who is going to go on some adventures, and it's great fun. I was very much thinking, God, I'll have to pass this on to my younger son, see what they get out of it, because there is a hint, even though it's very akin to those boys' own tales, the Kidnapped to the Treasure Island, etc. There is a fantasy element to it, and it is wrapped in a fantasy wrapper without doubt. I'll almost certainly do a full review of it. I've crystallised more of my longer form thoughts about it, but yeah, great fun to be had, and a real triumph, and another great read within my month. And the next one up is another very lauded indie book, and it's Thiago Abdalla's A Touch of Light. Again, there's a prequel to this, can be read in any order. A Touch of Light, again, was not what I thought it was going to be, and in fact, for a book that's loved as much as it is, I'm really surprised it doesn't split opinion a bit more than it does. It's a book with very straight line plot, and I would say, I mean, there's a start of the book, and there's a destination for that character, and it's sort of a straight line for what is a multi-POV character arc story, and certainly a straight line for the overall plot line of what the book wants to achieve by the end of it. But where the book differentiates itself from many other things is that it doesn't really reveal a lot of what the world is capable of, or what happens in the world. Like I say, we have these three POVs, and they all come from like a different faction or a different part of the world. It's one of the few books in a while that have really went back and looked for the map to kind of see geographically where everything was in relation to everything else. It needed that, because I wasn't ever going to see the connection of how they were ever going to meet up, or how these plot lines were even linked to each other. They seem to have similar things that happen to them, but they call them different names. They have, and you can see I'm struggling. I haven't fully crystallized my thoughts on this. I only finished this last night, and I'm like really trying to think about very carefully where I place my ideas in this. Nothing's told you about why certain things are happening. There's certain things that are alluded to in terms of events that are going to happen, and it's very clear that everybody in the story knows what they are, but you as the reader have no idea. Even the interrelations between the characters, people that have passed just before the start of the book till now, you don't know what they were doing, you're in the dark, and it's all kind of handed out very piecemeally, and I would have thought that would have turned a lot of people off, but it doesn't seem to have done, or else we of the self-published and indie reading community are very discerning readers. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I would have thought there'd been a bit of pushback around that. For some parts of it, I did struggle with the chapter to chapter. So if you have three POVs and they're kind of taking their turn each as you're going away around, by the time we came back to the person whose story just left, I couldn't quite remember where they were or what they were doing. Look, to say anything else, I really want to do a full review of this in a week or so's time, to kind of pull together my thoughts. Very much a book one in a series. Screams there's more. You only know a bit of the story here. You only know a bit of what's going on. I thought it was fabulous. It's one of the most exciting and interesting things that I've read in a long time, especially for a debut novel. Like, kidding me? Like, this is nuts. But there's very much a plan, and it sort of felt to me very like a Daniel Abraham book, that there's a lot of stuff being put in place here that's going to pay off later. That's what it felt to me. Again, could be wrong about that, but we'll see. Touch of Light, I thought, was brilliant. Next one, A I'm going to talk about is one that I have done a full review of, and it's Emil Akhtar's Lightblade. Stunning cover, and it's a bit of a chunky book. Like, it's a biggish book, but well spaced out and really well written. It tells the story of a young man who wants to assassinate the Emperor, except he's stuck in a pretty crappy job with no prospects. He has no real life. He just wants to make a name and make a difference for himself and avenge some of the bad things that have happened to him up to this point. Like I say, there's a full review of it. If you really want to find out more about it and what I think about it and what's really interesting about it, check that out. But suffice to say, the magic system lies in how we use the different spectrums of light. Different lights can be used for different outcomes and different things. We have a story where the stakes keep on changing as you make your way through it. What you think is going to be the end outcome, or you think is at stake, is always changing as you get given more information about the world and what's actually going on, because he is very much, our main character Josh is very much a small pea within the world that's around it. I really enjoyed Lightblade as well. I think, again, it's another very heavy action based story. There's not a ton of character development in it, but that's not the purpose of what the story is. It's a right good rollicking read. The last indie book I'm going to talk about is book 3 of The War Eternal from Rob J. Hayes, that I'd read the first 2 books of last month, and this one was from Cold Ashes Risen. Now, it's very hard to talk about book 3 in a series without kind of using spoilers, so I'm not going to, obviously, but what I will say, book 2 kind of lacked from a clear focus to it. Whereas I think book 3 has a very clear focus to it. It has a clear end goal. While this is a sort of 5-book series, it is written as a trilogy and then another 2 books. So it closes off at this point. We're still following Niskara as our main character. This very angry, bitter, not young woman anymore, but somebody that has a point to prove, or a destiny to fulfill in her eyes. And this one has a very clear point, I think, to it. Where she wants to go to, what she wants to achieve, and the hell and be down with everybody that gets in her way. This was my favorite book of the trilogy. This was a really strong finish. The world building that was done in book 2 pays off. We understand a lot more about the world that's happening here, and it's not hard to kind of want to push on and read book 4 that's in here, but I'm going to hold off for a month or 2 to kind of let this world sit. It's something I've really enjoyed at various stages. I find Niskara as a character very hard to love a lot of the times, but yet she's compelling enough that she keeps on bringing you back, and I think the resolution is excellent. This was my favourite book of the series, as I've said, and one that if you're unsure whether to go through book 2 or struggling with book 2, I would suggest please do, because I rattled my way through of Cold Ashes Risen. That's me and my fantasy books. If you want to stop watching now, you can. But I read another 2 books, and I'm going to start with one that kind of caught me a bit unawares, I've got to be honest, whether you realise it or realise it not. The Booker Prize shortlist was, a long list should I say, was announced, and normally I give it a cursory passing glance, but as it came up, one of the books that was on the list, I kind of went, I've seen that somewhere. Where have I seen that? And sure enough, on my bedside table, well, on my wife's bedside table, was sitting this book. And I looked over, and it's a really nothing book. It's only about 100 odd pages long. It's a book called Small Things Like These, by an author called Claire Keegan. Now, Small Things Like This, you'll see there's nothing to this book at all. It's a little novella, but it's been nominated for this very clear literary wonder of a prize. And I thought, right, well, I can rattle that out. I'll do it in one sitting or something. And in fact, when he opened it up and had a look, you see, even the pages, etc., are quite sparsely spaced. And what can I tell you? I read it, I did. And it's fucking brilliant. It's absolutely astoundingly good. It tells the story of a rural Irish town, and I'm always a bit worried because obviously I live in Ireland and I can identify with an awful lot of people in the places that are here. So for me to read this story, I kind of make an instant connection with it. I kind of know the rural villages, I know the stone cottages, I know the things that they're talking about and the events that are happening. So it's a man who grows up in this small rural village with his family, and he delivers coal and sticks for people. That's his job. We had coal men. He used to come around the doors. In fact, a lot of family friends were coalmen, etc. So I can identify it. Now, it's from the mid-80s, although initially you don't know that. It's kind of could be any place in time over the past 100, 200 years in Ireland. And it's basically the story of him existing within a village community, the life that he has and the way that people talk about him, and he considers himself to be aside and apart from it, but he lives in such a small community that he just can't help himself, even though he's not really aware of it. We just, as the reader, kind of go, right, okay, that's what that is, or otherwise. And he happens on an event, or on a situation of a couple of young girls within it. Now, it's not long enough to be drawn out into a whole thing. It gives you a flavour, but the world and everything that's evoked within this book is just so beautifully crafted and written. I mean, it's absolutely mind-blowing that somebody could capture so perfectly a place and a time, a setting, a way of thinking, kind of social responsibility, all of these things within 107 pages. I mean, just astounding. And the fact that I enjoyed it so much, and again, would have been nothing that I'd ever written other than just circumstance of it sitting beside the bed. My wife had started to read it and read through it, and we talked about it afterwards and the events that it links to historically, etc. I would never have read it. And it kind of made me, it's influenced my TBR for the next couple of months in trying to pick up stories that sit outside what I normally read and seeing if I can get anything out of it, or seeing whether this, just because this was set in a place and time that I could relate to, whether that is what drew me to it. But small things like this, these, terrific. And the last one I'm going to talk about is something that I read for a piece of content that I'm still thinking about doing for the channel, and it's book 1 of the Jack Reacher series. It's Killing Floor by Lee Child, and this very much mirrors, this is the story of the first series of the Amazon TV series. I was mainly reading it to see as a comparison between the TV series and the adaptation. By and large, it's very, very close. It only meanders off it in the last kind of 25% of the book, which is interesting in its own right. But this is a very long running series, very well thought of, and without kind of breaking down too much about the difference between the book of what I thought it was going to be and the adaptation, it's interesting how Reacher is written by Lee Child. It's very procedural. It's very much step by step. It's that kind of spectrumy mind. He walked in, he turned left, walked 5 yards, he sat down again, he looked around him from left to right, he opened up a book in front of himself while peering over the edges of the book. All very procedural, short sentences, certainly for the start of it, as we get introduced to Reacher. A couple of things that I don't think were very clear from book 1 anyway is actually the enormous unhulking size and physical presence of him. It's alluded to a little bit here and there, but it's not really forthright and out front as I thought it was going to be. But a really interesting read. Will I read more of the series? I mean, I wouldn't rush out and buy another one of it. I would say crime like this, which I used to read, so I'm not saying that I don't like it or anything, but it's the kind of book that I could just easily watch. There's enough crime procedurals on TV to say that that's the mode that I want this story to be told. You know, it's not fantastical enough so you can tell a story about crime and about murder in the real world on TV with a reasonable budget. You don't need the budget, maybe a book or a fantasy book needs with dragons or else around it. So, you know, that was my reading month. An interesting reading month that was obviously dominated by a lot of indie books. It's still shaken up, you know, as somebody that's a mood reader. I mean, who isn't? It's interesting to kind of look at and go, ooh, how's this changed? And it has changed me a lot this month for what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and mix up, you know, some of my fantasy, especially because a lot of the books that I plan to read over the next month or two in terms of fantasy are big, chunky books. Let me know if you've seen any of these, what, you know, where should go next, anything that's like these that link to them. If you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.